cards, and we will have folks coming by to pick up those note cards, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can for our speaker in the time that we have. As I say, it is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, but really, I think after this year, he doesn't really need an introduction. You know him. Vivek Ramaswamy has been an American business leader, successful entrepreneur, best-selling author, and of course, presidential candidate. He also serves, I'm proud to say, on Ashbrook's National Advisory Board on Civic Education. Thank you for your service, Vivek. And by the way, all this by age 38. I'm tempted to say that he's the smartest person in the room, but I'm not sure this room is big enough. During the campaign, Vivek brought his characteristic intellect, energy, and fresh perspective to the issues. Agree or disagree with him, you know where he stands and why. And he brings those same qualities to his topic this evening, American identity. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in welcoming the speaker for our 36th John M. Ashbrook Memorial Dinner, Mr. Vivek Ramaswamy.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate, Jeff, you and the work that you're doing here at the center. I got to say, the smartest person in the room is going to be one of those students who I met earlier today, actually. The 160 scholars I sat down with. They grilled me. They were harder questions that I got from the media in running for a year of U.S. president. There were harder questions or challenges that I got on those debate stages from the other candidates. And I just want to say that that's a special thing to actually have happen at a university. To have a place that prizes free speech and open debate. We say these words, but we've lost the content of those words. And you know what I love about this place is you don't aspire to be the biggest educational institution, but you aspire to be what Jeff told me earlier today, an oasis of excellence. And it's been my privilege to be here in that oasis today. So thank you, and may we wish well on those 160 students and the others in the program. I'll tell you, actually, I happened to be here myself a few years ago. This is my second time at this dinner. But the last time I came, I was actually sitting at the same table, the table reserved for the speaker, but I wasn't the speaker. I was sitting right next to the speaker that night, who was actually Mike Pence in 2021. It was the first time I had met Mike Pence, actually, was in this room and at that table. And I came in as he called me young man, and in a good way, in an encouraging way. And we had a spirited discussion about the problem of DEI spreading through corporate America. And we had a spirited exchange, and he went on to speak, and then he left. And the next thing I knew, a few years later, he was actually one of those people I'm on that debate stage right next to. Well, tonight I actually had a discussion with a young man at my table. James, he's actually going to receive the Alumni Award very soon. We had a spirited discussion about DEI in corporate America. And so all I know is if I see you on a debate stage a few years later, I'll know to I'll know to take appropriate caution. But it was a good discussion we had. The topic for tonight is American identity. I was thinking about that. Think about what's going on in college campuses across this country right now. Columbia, Yale, an alma mater of mine. What exactly is going on? People discuss this issue of anti-Semitism emerging across the country. What I see is actually something a little different than that. Listen to the chants of many of these students. Not on this campus. You don't see it here, and you don't see it here for a reason. This institution hasn't lost its sense of purpose. But you see it in college campuses across the board. You see these protests. One of the things I went through is I was listening carefully, this is a few months ago, to what many of these students were chanting on campus. They were chanting what sounded like intifada, which is the Arab word for uprising, which has a very specific connotation attached to the future existence of Israel. But you listen really closely to what these students were saying. On the recording, I'm not making this up, they were chanting infitada, which isn't even a word, actually, right? And it's striking. It's worth reflecting on that. It's one thing if you have a reasoned point of view or a firmly held point of view that counters mine or the majority of people in this country. And the beauty of the United States of America is you get to express that opinion. That's what makes America great. But what we see happening in the country right now is something else altogether. The people who are occupying Columbia University right now, it's not that they're against the values that many of us in this room share. I don't think so, actually. I think it's that they're lost. They're hungry for purpose and direction and identity and meaning. At a time in our history as a country where the things that used to fill that void, faith in God, patriotism, belief in your country, hard work, family, these things have disappeared. And that leaves a moral vacuum in our hearts, a deep black hole. And when you have a black hole that runs that deep, that is when the poison fills the void. It almost doesn't matter what the poison is, actually. You go straight down the list. Pick your favorite one. Wokeism, transgenderism, climatism, COVIDism, anti-Semitism. I would argue Zelenskyism. I know that's controversial in some circles. But it almost doesn't matter what it is. There's an old adage. It goes, if you have a hole the size of God in your heart and God does not fill it, something else will instead. If you don't pledge allegiance to that flag, you will quite literally pledge allegiance to a different flag. Instead, it's how we're wired. It's our nature as human beings to want to believe in something bigger than ourselves. That's what we hunger for. I'm 38. I'm the youngest person ever to have run for U.S. president as a Republican. And I can tell you something, speaking as a member of my generation, we are hungry to be part of something bigger than ourselves, yet we cannot even answer what it means to be an American today. And I think that is the charge for the future of our conservative movement. We had a red wave that never came in 2022. That's actually what pulled me into the presidential race. They blame Trump. They blame abortion. I think it's none of that. I think it's the fact that we have grown accustomed, I would say addicted, to simply criticizing what the other side puts on offer, but without offering an alternative vision of our own. What do we actually stand for as conservatives? Forget us conservatives. As Americans, what is it that we stand for? That's a harder question to answer. You got young people across this country. Actually, when I was a student, we actually had protests of a different kind on Harvard's campus. They used to actually starve themselves for all of 8 hours. It's like, for me, that's just like the amount of time you take between meals, you know. But hey, call it a fast. You get some credit for it. But they were starving for what were higher salaries for Harvard's janitors. And I'm not saying that wasn't a worthy cause, but it turns out that the janitors there were actually paid a lot more than the people who lived just 3 miles away in Boston, who they weren't starving for. What they really were is they were hungry for a cause, actually. And when you're hungry for a cause, you can't fill that hunger with fast food. We try to do that, right? We have a culture that teaches you, you're hungry, go to Ben & Jerry's and order a cup of ice cream with some social justice sprinkles on top. But you can't satisfy a moral hunger with fast food. We hunger for the real thing. And that's what I want to see us. It's a standard I will hold myself to and all of you to, us to level up and actually fill that void with our answer to what it means to be an American today. What does it mean to be a citizen of this nation in the year 2024? To me, it means we believe in the ideals of 1776. Ideals like merit and the pursuit of excellence. That you do get ahead in this country, not on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character and your contributions. That is why we as conservatives are against affirmative action and racial group quota systems. Not because we're against anything, but because we stand for merit, an idea that this country was founded on. Thank you. What does it mean to be American? That's what actually gives us our values. It means we believe in the rule of law. I say this as the kid of legal immigrants to this country. That means your first act of entering this country cannot break the law. And that is why I think we are in the right
to use our own military to secure our own borders, and to deport anybody who's in this country illegally, to end birthright citizenship for the kids of illegals, and to stop funding federal sanctuary cities across this country. That's not xenophobic, that's not racist, it's not against anybody. It is what it means to stand for the rule of law in the United States of America. A radical idea that our founding fathers fought for, that we the people create a government that is accountable to us, not the other way around. That the people who we elect to run the government ought to be the ones who actually run the government. Not a shadow government in a federal bureaucracy that really runs the show today, if we're being honest about it. People in three-letter agencies, FDA, FTC, SEC, TSA, God knows what. That's not what our founding fathers envisioned. And if you want to actually get serious about that, this was the core premise of my presidential campaign. You cannot incrementally reform that Leviathan. You have to be willing to actually take the non-incremental step of shutting it down. And you want a mass deportation of 3 million illegals from this country, I'm all in favor of that. Maybe 10 million illegals in this country. But don't forget the second mass deportation of also 3 million federal bureaucrats out of that federal bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., which is a mass deportation we ought not forget. But the point of these ideas, you take the things I just told you about, reviving meritocracy in the United States of America, the idea that we the people create a government accountable to us, where every citizen's voice and vote counts equally, in settling questions from climate change to racial justice, to the revival of the rule of law, to that old-fashioned idea anymore of free speech, that you get to speak your mind openly as long as I get to in return. Those are not Republican ideas or Democratic ideas. Those are not black ideas or white ideas. They are American ideals that our founding fathers fought a revolution to secure. And the question for us right now is, do we believe those ideals still exist or don't we? I think that's the moment we live in. I think 2024 is the 1776 of our century. I believe we live in a 1776 moment right now. Now, what a special time that was to be alive. Our founding fathers did not view themselves as just oppressed victims by a British monarchy. They made the sacrifices required to secure the liberties that we enjoy today. There's 56 men who signed that Declaration of Independence. Jeff just gave me a book, the first essay in that book. I love the values of the center. It's primary source material, actually. Not a lot of editorializing. It's Thomas Jefferson's editorializing, but not ours about him. I just opened that book. We were just looking at it together. He signed the Declaration of Independence. The final words that he and 56 men signed it with said, "We pledge our lives, our treasure, and our sacred honor with the will of divine providence." Those 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, in our 1776 moment, if you believe me on that, it's worth asking what became of them. They made some sacrifices. They're not that different from the people in this room, people who are supporting this center. They were philanthropic. They were successful. They were in the parlance of what many people on Columbia's college campus might call privileged, actually. But that's actually what made their sacrifices all the more notable. 56 men, 5 of them were captured by the British and tortured until their deaths. 12 of them had their homes ransacked or burned to the ground. 9 of them died in the Revolutionary War or for the consequences of it. 2 of them had their own children die in the Revolutionary War. Many of them died bankrupt because they had their property seized. And they knew the sacrifices they were making. They knew the risks they were taking when they stood up for the ideals enshrined in that declaration. But they did it anyway. They didn't do it for them. They did it for us. 250 years later. I often think about this. We face our founding fathers in the afterlife, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and they tell us these are the sacrifices we made to create this country. Now tell us about the sacrifices that you made to keep it. We better have a darn good answer for them. And that's the standard we ought to hold ourselves to today. I think I speak for everybody in this room, certainly everybody who's a parent when I say this. The inheritance we want to give our kids isn't just a bunch of green pieces of paper. It is a country greater than the one that we grew up in. That's what our founding fathers gave us. That's the standard we ought to hold ourselves to today. And that takes some real sacrifice. For those who have money, I have been blessed to be one of those people in this country. I wasn't born into money. My parents came to this country with no money 40 years ago. And in a single generation, I've gone on to found multiple multi-billion-dollar companies. I did it while marrying my wife, Apurva, who's a cancer surgeon at Ohio State's Cancer Hospital, whose parents came as immigrants and lived that same American dream. But it's not just writing a check that does it. If you're going to write a check that actually makes you feel it, that actually makes you understand the sacrifice that you're making. Writing a check isn't the only way to change this country. When you are the only person in a room who believes what you do, maybe it's a school board meeting, maybe it's a parent-teacher conference, maybe it's a corporate board meeting. When you are the only person in a room who believes what you do, you have an obligation to this country, now more than ever, to stand up and actually say it. Say it with a spine. Say it with conviction. Say it with respect. But part of respect is that you respect your neighbor enough to tell him what you actually think, not some sanitized, woke-washed version of it. That's what this country was founded on. That's what you're teaching the scholars in this program here and the students who are going to be the people who ultimately we rely on to save this country. Because I'll tell you this, if my two kids, we're talking about them, one of them 4 years old, one of them's yet to be 2. If they are in high school before we get this right, I don't think we have a country left. I don't mean that hyperbolically. I mean that in the literal sense. The United States of America that Thomas Jefferson and his 55 compatriots signed into existence with that declaration. I don't think that America will exist if we don't get this right before my kids are in high school. So speaking as a citizen and as a parent, that's our window that we're working with it. And if you want to understand how well we're doing, you want a litmus test along the way, here's what it is. It is the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually think in public. Right now, we are doing poorly. But it doesn't have to stay that way. The only way we're going to get this right is by all of us starting to speak our minds in the open again, to stand for the truth without apology, to say the things that we know to be true, but that you just can't say anymore. That God is real. That there are 2 genders. That fossil fuels are a requirement for human prosperity. That reverse racism is racism. That an open border is not a border. That parents should determine the education of their children. That the nuclear family isn't a bad word. It's the greatest form of governance known to mankind. That capitalism isn't a dirty word. It is the best known system to man to lift us up from poverty. That there's 3 branches of government in the United States, not 4. That our U.S. Constitution is the strongest and greatest guarantor of freedom in human history. These things are controversial not because they are false, but because they are true. And I think this is the moment where we stand for truth again as Americans. And if we do, then I don't think we have to anymore be this nation in decline that we've become. We've been taught to accept that we're at the end of the ancient Roman Empire, that all we have left is to fight over the scraps of some shrinking pie, another footnote in the history of fallen nations. No, I don't think we have to be that nation in decline. I don't think we have to be at the end of the ancient Roman Empire. And by the way, it's a funny thing happens when you study history. There was no one rise and one fall of Rome. There were many rises and many falls, and I think there will be many rises and many falls of our American story as well. So no, we're not at the end of this. We don't have to be. We don't have to be a nation in decline. What I see in the country when I listen to those kids chanting "Infitada" on college campuses, what I really hear is a nation that is still a little young, actually, going through our own version of our adolescence, figuring out who we're going to be when we grow up. And when you view it that way, it all makes sense again, to me at least. It does. You go through your adolescence, you go through your identity crisis. You forget who you are. You lose your way a little bit. You say some stupid things. But we are stronger for it when we get to our adulthood on the other side. And so, no, I don't think we have to be that nation in decline. I think we still can be a nation in our ascent. Maybe even the early stages of our ascent. Maybe we're not even at base camp. On our way still to that shining city on a hill. I see Ashland welcomes President Reagan. Maybe we'll close with some Reagan today. I'm not going to tell you it's morning in America right now. I don't think Ronald Reagan would either, because it's not. It's not true, but it can be. I'm not going to tell you that the American dream is alive and well. It is not. It is alive and hanging on for life support, but it can be. We still can be that shining city on a hill, that country where we will look our kids in the eye, where I will look my two sons in the eye and still tell them that the United States of America is still the nation, where no matter who you are, or where your parents came from, or what your skin color is, or how long your last name is, in some of our cases, my kid's case, that you will still get ahead in this country with your own hard work, your own commitment, your own dedication. And that you know what? You are free to speak your mind at every step of the way. That is the American dream. That is who we are. That is what we are running to. And with your help, and with your sacrifice, that is what we will revive to save this great nation. Thank you for coming today, guys. God bless you and your families and the students here. Jeff, thank you. And may God bless our great country, the United States of America. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'll take your questions. That's right. That's right. Thank you. I forgot the Q&A. Yeah. Yeah.
We do have some questions from the audience here.
Thank you.
The first one is an interesting one. I think this comes from a student. The question is, what was a
Policy area about which you have changed your mind, and why did you change your mind?
There's a lot of things over the last few years. I'm going to think about something in the last year during the presidential campaign. I'll give you two. One is we were just talking about at the dinner table. It's not that I changed my mind, but I've changed my emphasis on it as an issue. I think that the experience of meeting parents across this country who have lost their kids to the fentanyl crisis, I think did change my view on the sense of urgency we have to bring to address a man-made problem that still has a man-made solution attached to it. And so I'm ashamed to say, actually, when I started my run for U.S. president, I listed out a lot of my policies on day one. I didn't pay heed to that one. It's traveling this country and meeting. You can't talk to 100 people without meeting a handful at least who had their own family members or close friends or neighbors afflicted by really something that's closer to bioterrorism than it is a drug addiction issue. I mean, the number of parents who I met one family in Iowa. Kathy and Derek were the parents' names. Their son was Sebastian. He was 17. He died of what was described to me as a fentanyl overdose. Turns out he had actually bought a Percocet on Snapchat. Didn't know it contained fentanyl. It did. It was laced with fentanyl. He took it, and actually, that's how he died. That's not an overdose. That is poisoning, actually. If you put it in a Big Mac, you wouldn't call it that either. It's closer to bioterrorism. And so I think that's one of the areas where I have been radicalized as an issue where I believe we have man-made solutions to that man-made problem. And it was something that I didn't begin with at the time I began my campaign. See if I can give you a good answer on something where I've changed my mind. How about this? I'll give it some thought over the course of the rest of the questions, but that'd be one where I change my emphasis, and I want to give you a good answer to the first one as well.
Well, here's another question about the presidential run. The questioner asks, what did you learn running for president?
Oh, a lot of things. I learned a lot of things running for president. It still hasn't been that long ago. We're talking 3 months ago, and so I'm processing a lot of those learnings by the day. One of the things that I will say, if I were to give myself a year ago or a year and a half ago some advice, was I did learned that you're running a process like that, politics is a blood sport. And it's easy to let your competitive instincts, if you're a competitive person, and I am, to let your competitive instincts get the better of you at times. And the best piece of advice I would have given myself and to give to anybody else who would do it in the future is taking actually a few minutes every day to relocate your purpose that brought you into it in the first place. I feel that sense of purpose now. I felt it the day I declared my run for president. And there were flashes of it at every step of the way. But I was in a particularly tough position because at the time I declared for president, nobody really knew who I was, actually. Mike Pence did because we sat together here. But other than that, there weren't that many who did. And I think that we had to run the campaign in a way where it was 24/7, nonstop, all the time for a year-long sprint. The first 6 months of that was just establishing relevance. So I'm not sure there was a different way I could have done it. Maybe there is. But nonetheless, I think if I was to do it better, it would actually be, especially in that second half of the campaign, maybe do a little bit less, but leave some space to forget about the politics of the moment, forget about who else is running, forget about what's in the news or what the press is asking you that day, and just take a minute to reflect on, I say we live in a 1776 moment, take an hour, take a few minutes every day to reflect for myself on what that means. And I think that, you know what, you live and you learn, and I learned a million things. I'm grateful for the process. And the other thing actually I learned is that we're not as divided as we are taught to believe. This is a big one. See, the media, social media teaches us we're divided to a breaking point. And I think we are reaching a breaking point in this country, but not in the same way. It's not a 50-50 divide between red and blue or black and white. Those are made-up myths that we're taught to just consume and swallow at face value. No. 80% of us in this country, and I'm usually in the campaign for a Republican primary, my campaign advisors told me, why on earth are you going to the south side of Chicago and Kensington in the inner city of Philadelphia in the middle of a Republican primary? And I said, well, I'm running to lead a nation. I'm not just running to lead a political party. And then I get 8% at the Iowa caucus and realize they might have had a point. But I learned a lot from that process nonetheless, which is that even you go to places like that room in the south side of Chicago where I was. I haven't been in a Republican room where you had more agreement on the importance of sealing our southern border than a community that was, 95% black room, 150% Democrat, I'm told. It depends on how they count. But, nonetheless, they're converting South Shore High School into an encampment for migrants at a cost of $7,000 per migrant per month, when the people in that community are rightly asking, what the heck about me? I'm an American sitting right here. So I think that's one of the things I learned, is that we're far more united than you would learn by turning on cable television or looking at social media. And you know what? Half the 20% on the other side are people younger than me who never learned those ideals in the first place. We can bring them along too. And so that's one of the things I learned, is that the national division is a bit of a myth. Most Americans have common sense. Most Americans understand that if you have two X chromosomes, you're a woman, and if you have an X and a Y, you're a man. Common sense is not what we're lacking as Americans. Thomas Paine would have said the same thing. What we lack for is actually courage. Right? Common sense we've got plenty of. I think courage is what we actually need. And when we go back to saying in public what you otherwise say in private, you take that Overton window. It's right now looks like that door opened in the back, a very narrow channel to get out of an otherwise captive room. What I tried to do in the campaign was to take a truck and drive it through that Overton window. And if I was to do it again, that would be one thing that I wouldn't change and that I would keep intact, because I think this country needs it.
The next question is,
just as you have often been critical of the American left, you have also been critical of conservatives for some positions. What is your most prominent criticism of the contemporary conservative movement?
There are nits here and there, but I think I'll give you two. One is, I don't believe incrementalism will work. I don't believe it. I think it's a myth. I think many people who say that we have a corrupt fill in the blank, FBI, Department of Education, ATF, CDC, believe that, I'm going to put in a new head of the FBI. Fire Christopher Wray was a popular line amongst my peers running for U.S. president. We get James Comey 2.0. You have still a machine that sits underneath it, a Department of Education that you might try to put Betsy DeVos, a good enough person on top, say reform it. Now it's spending more money and spouting more toxicity on our educational system than it ever has before. I think the right answer for many of these institutions is you have to be willing to take the risk of shutting them down. Shut down the Department of Education. Return that money to parents across this country to be able to choose where they send their kids to school. Does that come with some risk? Yes, it does. Will that come with some inconvenience? Yes, it will. I cannot make a promise, nor can any other Republican or anyone else, to say that you're going to cut just the right amount. You're always taking some risk. Either you're not going to cut enough fat. Well, that one doesn't work because if you have an 8-headed hydra, you cut off one of the heads, it grows right back. Or you're taking the risk of cutting too much and maybe cutting some muscle. You're always taking a risk. It's only a question of which risk you're willing to take. And where I depart with many conservatives is I am willing to take the risk of cutting some muscle because I think that we have to take some risk if we're actually going to take a chance of reviving our three-branch constitutional republic. And then my other criticism is we can't do it this year. I worry about this one this year as I did in 2022. We cannot satisfy ourselves with just criticizing the radical Biden agenda. That is a formula for electoral failure. It is a formula for failure even if we nominally win the election. We have to do the hard work of defining who we are and what we stand for. Yes, the left will feed our nation's youth race, gender, sexuality, and climate. We cannot be complacent to just criticize that vision without offering an alternative vision of our own. Individual, family, nation, and God beat race, gender, sexuality, and climate if we have the courage to stand for something. That's my call to our movement.
Fiscal responsibility used to be a core tenet of the conservative movement. It seems like many Republicans or conservatives don't talk much anymore about the federal deficit
Or out of control federal debt. What should we do about it?
So look, I think that there are lower hanging fruit approaches that actually, I don't think it's going to I'm not going to say make everyone happy, but actually could avoid the otherwise dire consequences of cutting off people's access to Social Security or Medicaid, even Medicare, even when they've been promised that and paid into it for years, versus having a national debt problem of $34 trillion and growing. I don't think it's a binary choice. Actually, Bob McEwen and I were just talking about it on the drive over here. We could actually delever in the way that a company would. We have many national assets that we can sell, monetize, to be able to pay down that national debt. Let me start with one of the easiest ones. The oil and gas underneath our own ground. Extract it and sell it. Drill, frack, burn coal. Sell it and buy down trillions of dollars of our national debt along the way. And so I do think that we live in a complicated moment. Actually, someone in the photo line gave me this coin of, thank you, whoever it was. It's still here, Abraham Lincoln. Abe Lincoln, you made me think, and the thing I mentioned to you when you gave it to me was Abraham Lincoln, actually, at the height of the Civil War, what he said is the dogmas of a quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. And I do think in many ways the dogmas of 1980 may be inadequate to the present of today. The core principles still remain, but we're not going to just move our country forward by reciting slogans we memorized 40 years ago. Ronald Reagan wouldn't tell us to do that if he were alive today. But if we rise to our own occasion, we can apply those same principles, but in ways that don't just resort to historical talking points, but look at opportunities in the present, like using our own natural resources, using them to buy down our national debt. If you buy down half of our national debt, interest payments actually go down by more than half, because interest payments actually are tied to the underlying risk of the asset, and so the interest payments on our national debt are going to be less than half what they are if our national debt is half of what it is today. And I think that's a way we're going to be able to get through this in a way that does not involve undercutting the trust of people who've paid into Social Security and Medicare. Now, if the interest payments on our national debt become the largest line item in our federal budget, which could happen as soon as the next 5 to 10 years, then we're toast, because then we're in quicksand, which brings me back to the time period we're working with. If my kids are in high school before we get this right, I don't think we have a country left. But I think we live in a window right now where we might have our last best chance to get this right. And I think it's going to be up to Republicans, conservatives more broadly, to actually define what we stand for and what are our specific solutions, rather than just our criticisms of the left.
Here's a question about social media. What is your opinion on social media, in particular TikTok, and bills banning TikTok?
So I got this in the classroom earlier, and I'll say it here too. I have major concerns about the widespread, addictive spread of social media, especially amongst the nation's youth. I personally believe that if you can't smoke an addictive cigarette by the age of 18, if you can't have an addictive drink of alcohol by the age of 21, you shouldn't be able to use an addictive social media app before the age of 16 either. And I think that that is a legitimate policy position for the GOP to embrace. That's the first problem. To the second problem of forced data transfers to the CCP. That's a major problem alleged with TikTok. It is a major problem known with many, even American companies. I mentioned one earlier, Airbnb, which is, according to the Wall Street Journal reporting, hands over U.S. user data as of a couple of years ago to the Chinese Communist Party. It's wrong no matter who does it. Ban the bad behavior. And if you want to identify a further bad behavior of government actors like the CCP, putting pressure on individual social media companies through the back door to censor or promote certain content to protect the CCP, ban that behavior. I don't think government actors I don't think companies should be allowed to take pressure from government actors without telling their users that they're actually doing it. So now let's take the ultimate example of a government actor pressuring the social media company to protect the CCP. A few years ago, in the year 2020 or much of 2021, if you wanted to go on social media or on the internet or post a video on YouTube saying that the COVID-19 pandemic began in a lab in China, as we know to be true today, and let's be honest, as we knew to be true 3 years ago, your account would have been locked. You would have been censored. But you know who was doing it? Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, American domiciled companies at the behest of not the CCP, but of the U.S. government itself. And so do I have major concerns about social media usage? I do. Address them across the board, even over the lobbying efforts of American social media companies who will oppose it. Do I have major concerns about U.S. or any company engaging in forced U.S. user data transfers to the CCP? Absolutely I do. Ban it across the board, whether it's TikTok or any other company doing it. Do I have major concerns about the backdoor persuasion risk of governments using social media companies to persuade large audiences or hide information from them by making backdoor threats to companies? Require any company that's responding to a government threat to disclose that to their users so we actually know. But that's the way we actually deal with it, rather than a cheap game of whack-a-mole, because otherwise the problem's just going to reemerge in a different way. If we want to identify the problem, actually deal with the problem through the front door, and that's what I would favor doing.
This question is short and simple. It says, what qualities does the vice president need? Just asking for a friend.
You know, I think the right answer to that question is best defined by who the president actually is. And I think every president deserves to shape his cabinet in the way that his governing agenda is going to demand. And I think one of the things that I'll be very frank. I mean, I've had great discussions with President Trump after, I stepped outside from the race, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure he's successfully elected as our next president. And one of the things that I see in him is an ambition and a desire to make sure that that second term goes far further than the first did in reviving this country. And I'm empathetic to that. I'm a political outsider. I ran for president the first time, this last time, and I learned so much that I would do differently even if I ran that campaign again. Well, he was an outsider who came into this for the first time, too. And I think he's learned a lot from that first experience as well that I'm confident he will put to the test. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of people, I think, who are going to be required to make that a team effort to revive this country. For my part, as a leader, when I ran for president, I tell you what kind of vice president I was looking for, is somebody who would challenge me, somebody who would bring out the best version of myself. That's how I've built my companies. But I think that there's many different ways different presidents may choose to structure that. But whatever decision, hopefully President Trump's elected as the next president, whatever decision he makes, I think that that's something that all of us who are rooting for the success of this country have an obligation to root for his success as well. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure he's successfully elected. And I'm going to ask all of you to hopefully root for the success of our country on the back of that as well. So, thank you.
You've been a very successful entrepreneur, and you say that you're strongly in favor of capitalism. Why are you such a fan of free enterprise and capitalism?
I'm a fan of capitalism as distinct from crony capitalism.
That's the first distinction I want to actually define out of the gate, because many disagreements, who was it, Wittgenstein, who famously said most moral problems are just problems of language, actually. So you're just talking past each other. You actually argue with somebody on the question of capitalism, you realize you're not arguing about the same thing. They're talking about crony capitalism, I'm talking about the real thing. I'm against corporate welfare provided by taxpayers. I was against the 2008 bailouts on the back of the 2008 financial crisis. I'm against corporate welfare today and all of the forms where it shows up in legislation that most congressmen don't read before they sign on the dotted line. I'm against the ESG cancer in our capital markets, which is a reverse form of crony capitalism where government actors are using private sector entities in the communications and financial services sectors to accomplish through the back door what they could not do through the front door. None of that is capitalism. And so I'm dead set against that, whether it's a left-wing or right-wing criticism of it. I'm against all forms of capture of government as an instrument to blockade competition. But why do I stand for the true thing, true capitalism? The way you get ahead in free market capitalism is you provide something of greater value to someone than it costs to you to provide it. That's the only lasting way to build an enterprise in a system of true free market capitalism. It's fundamentally an other regarding activity. And so I'm a fan of it for two reasons. One is it is the best known system that human history has to offer us to lift all people up from poverty. And so it's not the case for capitalism that comes from the top, but from the bottom. And the second thing that capitalism provides in the United States, and this is particularly important in the American context, is it actually provides a basis for our solidarity as citizens. Alexis de Tocqueville traveled this country, a century and a half or more ago, and he said this is not supposed to last. Okay, this large, expansive nation with diverse ethnic backgrounds and religions, there's no common cohesion. It will crumble under the weight of its own division unless we have certain sacred apolitical sanctuaries, what he called intermediary institutions, that bind us together regardless of our politics. What does that mean in the present day? It means that we could fight like cats and dogs when it comes to politics, but we'll go to the football stadiums or the baseball stadiums or the biotech labs or the businesses of this country or the manufacturing facilities in this state and come together regardless of whether we are black or white or gay or straight or Democrat or Republican. That, too, is, I think, the underappreciated, not power of capitalism, but the requirement of capitalism in a diverse, divided democratic republic like the United States, is it provides an apolitical sanctuary where we can still unite and find common purpose in those private sector institutions, even at a moment of deep political division 160 years ago, as it is true today. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. In history here, and I'm going to ask you this question. We always ask our speakers this: who is your favorite person in American history?
Yeah. So,
Thomas Jefferson would be my answer to that question. And not because he was a slaveholder, as the left will incessantly remind us, right? It gets old at a certain point. But I think it's because, but I think there's something to it, though. Actually, there's something to it. I mean, the things I love about Thomas Jefferson is, I said this to some of the students in the room earlier today where I spoke with them. Very impressed with the questions we got there, by the way. Sharp. But one of the thoughts I left him with is that Thomas Jefferson was not just the guy who signed that Declaration of Independence. He was an inventor. He was a polymath. He was kind of genius. He was fluent in 7, 8, 9 languages, could write and read several more. He was an inventor of the polygraph test, an early version of the lie detector test. He literally invented the swivel chair. He engineered that while writing the Declaration of Independence. Can you believe that? It's Thomas Jefferson. He bankrupted himself donating to libraries across this country. Think about how different that is from today's class of public servants. Today, people go into public service in many cases to monetize that and make money from it. He bankrupted himself to serve the very public that he went into public service for in the first place. This is a guy who welcomed Joseph Priestley, him and Benjamin Franklin, somebody who actually had beliefs that defied the Anglican Church and said, you know what, come to this country. You can believe religiously whatever you want as long as you're actually committed to the civic ideals of this country and following the law. He welcomed Joseph Priestley, who was the first known scientist who immigrated to America on account of the freedoms that this country had to offer. And he certainly wasn't the last. So that was Thomas Jefferson. I appreciate him for a lot of those reasons because he was not just a political figure, right? He was an intellectual. He was ambitious, signed off on the Lewis and Clark expeditions at a time where that was a crazy thing to do as a U.S. president. Imagine how far westward this country could go. He had that sense of vision, that daring sense of exploration, that sense that you don't have to be a pre-trained expert in some domain to dabble in it. But I'm going to be curious. I care enough about this country. The short time we're given, there's more to this life than just the aimless passage of time, going through the motions, doing what our iPhones tell us to do on a given day. That wouldn't have been Thomas Jefferson today. Here, a guy probably would have put down his iPhone and figured out how he could actually invent the next great creation that got people off their iPhones while actually reminding ourselves of what were the principles that brought us to this country and to stand for this country in the first place. But I want to tie it up with the criticism that you hear of Thomas Jefferson now from the left, is that, but he was a slaveholder. How could he write that all men are created equal while also being one of the most, I would say the largest, among the largest of slaveholders of our founding fathers? And I think that's really why I give you Thomas Jefferson as the answer, is that he was a human being. And he reminds us that we would rather be, I would speak for myself, I would rather be a citizen of a country that has ideals and falls short of them than to be a citizen of a country that does not have any ideals at all. And that's, I think, what he reminds us of, and his legacy reminds us of, is he was a fallen human being, just like every one of us in this room today. Our founding fathers, like us, they were not gods. They were fallen human beings. Yet they strived for certain ideals. And that means you're always going to fall short of those ideals. We always have. We always will. I'm sure we do right now. I'm sure there's things 250 years from now that somebody will look back at the heroes of today and criticize them for it. But that's what makes America great again. We're not founded on the pursuit of, we're not founded on the existence of perfection. We're founded on the pursuit of perfection, the pursuit of a more perfect union, the pursuit of liberty, equality, and justice for all. And so when Thomas Jefferson signed that Declaration of Independence, it wasn't because he was perfect, but he was signing on to a pursuit of perfection, a pursuit of a more perfect union that we still 250 years later, in the year 2024, continue today. So with that, I want to thank you all for welcoming me again. May God bless you and your families and our great country. And may we have another 250 years and then some yet to come. Thank you all. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Tell me, how should we head on?
Head down that way and then
right out. Thank you, Dan.